Autumn in New York, the Taylor family. It was the kind of crisp autumn afternoon in upstate New York where every golden leaf seemed to linger in the air, and the stately maples lining the drive to the Taylor estate glowed like embers in the waning sunlight. The Taylor home itself stood at the end of a sweeping cul-de-sac, its stately gray stone façade echoing decades of stability and quiet privilege. Pumpkins and mums crowded the porch, and an aroma of cinnamon drifted from the kitchen. Tiny details that Emma, the family's daughter-in-law, took pride in orchestrating to perfection. Emma Taylor, by now the dedicated wife to Mark, fit into this picture of domestic prosperity in all the ways that mattered. With soft blonde waves and gentle hands, she found contentment in the rhythms of home. Arranging flowers in the foyer, planning Sunday dinners, and tending lovingly to every corner of the house. Mark, the only child of Helen and Charles Taylor, worked with his father in the family's real estate business, chasing deals in Manhattan during the week and unwinding among the rolling lawns and stone patios of their home on weekends. Helen Taylor, Mark's mother, an undisputed matriarch, presided over the household with a kind of reserved elegance. She was generous with praise, discerning with criticism, and, to Emma, both a source of guidance and a standard to live up to. Helen believed that the unity and image of the Taylor family were paramount. She chaired charity events, fostered connections throughout the community, and always followed tradition. Inside the Taylor home, routines had a comforting regularity. Mark read the Wall Street Journal over breakfast. Helen tended her roses in the garden, and Emma kept the household running smoothly, rarely drawing attention to her own needs. Sundays were reserved for family brunches on the back veranda, overlooking copper-colored woods, with laughter mingling with the call of migrating geese overhead. Despite the comforts and apparent harmony, the Taylor home was not untouched by subtle tensions. Emma sometimes wondered if she would ever truly belong. Her own roots were simpler, less glamorous than Mark's, and she occasionally felt out of step in a world that seemed woven together long before her arrival. Still, she cherished this life. The sense of belonging, the little kindnesses from Helen, and the deeply loyal, if sometimes emotionally distant, affection from Mark. As the season deepened and preparations for Thanksgiving began, there was a quiet sense of anticipation, of family traditions, of another chapter closing gently. For Emma, autumn at the Taylor estate glimmered with both fulfillment and the unspoken hope that she had, at last, found her place in the world. The first shock. It happened abruptly, slicing through what had been a season of gentle routine. The initial signs were subtle, an unusual tightness in Helen Taylor's expression as she pored over the upstairs, office's spreadsheets late into the night, the shuffle of paperwork replacing the calm note of afternoon tea. The Taylor estate, so accustomed to an undercurrent of peace, absorbed the tension like a storm, rolling in unnoticed. One chilly Tuesday morning, while leaves gathered in brilliant piles along the driveway, Helen summoned Emma into the family study. The setting was as formal as a courtroom. Dark mahogany desk, long windows letting in slanted light, papers arranged meticulously at Helen's side. Mark, recently home from the city, stood nearby with furrowed brows, the air charged with unsaid words. Helen, measured and unyielding, explained that there had been a concerning financial irregularity discovered within the family business accounts, a significant amount missing, numbers not aligning. Her tone balanced civility and suspicion. Mark spoke little, but the way his eyes avoided Emma's told her more than words. Confused and disoriented, Emma tried to process the allegations as Helen laid out what seemed an airtight case against her. Login records, access times, transactions that pointed in Emma's direction. Yet Emma had never once handled the deeper layers of company finances. Her dealings were limited to idle receipts and running household expenses. Still, the facts hovered menacingly in the room, and suddenly, she realized every mundane action in her recent weeks could be twisted as evidence. Mark, usually her quiet advocate, now seemed distant and uncertain, torn between loyalties, between Helen's steely determination and her husband's wavering trust. Emma found herself isolated. The family's dependence on appearances made discussions brief and private. No outbursts, no chance to plead her case at the dinner table. Instead, the conversation died, leaving only glances and closed doors. The aftermath was agony. Whispers replaced conversations. Emma felt the weight of suspicion in every silence. Invitations to community events that once included her suddenly dried up, as if word, unspoken, unexplained, had spread. Even the household staff regarded her with awkward sympathy, avoiding her gaze in the hallways. At night, lying awake and replaying each detail, Emma grasped for understanding. Was there someone with a grudge? Could it have been a mistake? A technical error? No one seemed interested in exploring these questions. Her own voice felt fragile and small, drowned out by the Taylor family's need for quick resolution and their desire to shield themselves from public embarrassment. The shock was not only in the accusation itself, but in the cold realization that, when tested, the family she had worked so hard to please closed ranks against her. The house that had once filled her with warmth now seemed colder, its grand halls echoing with doubt. Emma's world, so carefully built on trust and belonging, began to crumble, and she understood with painful clarity that sometimes, in the most beautiful places and within the most perfect families, love was not always enough to protect truth.
Emma,
a
it's
wound
over now.
that could not be defended. That night, the halls of the Taylor estate felt colder than ever before. Shadows from the ancient oak trees danced along the stone walls, wavering in the golden lamplight, like the memories Emma tried so hard to hold on to. The accusation had already begun to seep into every part of her world, poisoning the little moments of grace she once cherished. She wandered aimlessly for a while, fingers grazing the spines of books in the silent study, trying desperately to piece together how her ordinary days could amount to a crime she did not commit. Whenever she entered a room, the air seemed charged, thick with judgment, swollen with uncertainty. The light footsteps of the housekeeper faded at the sound of her approach. The gardener, usually warm and chatty, simply nodded and looked away. Even in the kitchen, a place of comfort with its perpetual aroma of baked bread and spiced tea, Emma felt lost, unwelcome. She found herself performing her duties, folding towels, arranging fall flowers, clearing the dinner table, without thought, as if through a pane of frosted glass. The most painful moments, however, were with Mark. He no longer looked at her with the gentle curiosity that first drew her in all those years ago. Their conversations, once alive with dreams and plans, became transactional, clipped. When she tried to explain, to grasp his hand, and plead her innocence, Mark's eyes would flicker past her, fixed and haunted. He listened, but he did not hear. Emma noticed the way his jaw tightened and his lips quivered with doubt as he reassured her with words that rang hollow. "I just need time, Emma. Please understand." But what was she to understand when the truth, that she was innocent, was all she had to offer? In the grand bedroom, that they once called their sanctuary. Emma lay awake as Mark's breaths fell into heavy, troubled rhythms. Every night felt interminable, the house settling with creaks and groans, as if the very walls pondered the evidence against her. She'd watch dawn break in gray streaks through the velvet curtains, her heart pounding with dread for the day ahead. The isolation grew unbearable as Helen, always so poised and regal, began to deliver subtle reminders of her distrust. When Helen hosted tea with her socialite friends, Emma's invitation was conspicuously absent. She stopped asking Emma for her opinion on the arrangements for their annual autumn charity gala. At dinner, Helen's small talk with Mark would dance around Emma, careful not to touch her, as if her presence alone might disrupt the delicate balance of the family name. Emma's phone, once a lifeline, filled with cheerful messages from friends in town and texts from neighbors, fell silent. Calls went unanswered. Invitations to book clubs and Sunday brunches evaporated.
You did?
She caught whispers at the edge of her hearing in grocery stores and on strolls through the village square. She's the one, isn't she? The tailor's daughter-in-law. Shame about the money. Eyes she used to greet now slid quickly away, as if acknowledging her would somehow implicate them too. For a time, Emma fought back, clinging to hope that the truth would win out. She compiled every receipt, sent emails politely offering explanations, even asked Mark to let her speak to the family accountant or an attorney. But her efforts were met with polite stonewalling. The investigators are handling it, Emma. It's best not to interfere. In those moments, she realized how little her word weighed against the legacy of the Taylors. Blood was thicker than vows, trust more fragile than autumn leaves. The shifting of seasons brought only more sorrow. The garden, once her refuge, now mirrored her grief as flowers withered and the vibrant foliage dulled beneath the weight of early frosts. Emma's body grew thin, movements mechanical. Her eyes often searched her own reflection in the ornate mirror above the marble mantel, searching for some visible mark that would explain why. Why her? What had she done, aside from loving a family that was never truly her own? Still, fragments of memories comforted and tormented her in equal measure. Trips to the Hudson in springtime, Mark's gentle kiss beneath the arbor as fireflies rose at dusk, Helen's approving nod the day Emma arranged a perfect Thanksgiving table. Did none of it mean anything? Was she simply an outsider, doomed from the start to be a scapegoat should misfortune ever descend? One particularly bitter evening, as a storm lashed the windows and thunder rolled over the hills, Emma reached her breaking point. The rain drummed a relentless tattoo against her window pane as she packed a small suitcase. She worked quietly, old habits of silence and discretion still guiding her. She took only what she truly needed: a photograph of her younger self, her favorite wool sweater, and a single hardback novel given to her by Mark in the early days of their courtship. She left her wedding band on the dresser without a note. As she crept down the main hallway, memories surfaced with each step. Laughter echoing from last Thanksgiving, Helen's approving touch on her shoulder after a charity luncheon, Mark's sleepy good night, murmured in the darkness. Each memory a tiny loss, all tangled in grief and longing. When she reached the foyer, she paused, letting her fingers trace the smooth banister one final time. The shadows of the past 10 years seemed to stretch and writhe around her, not quite ready to let go. She took a breath, steadying herself for the world beyond the heavy oak door, a world that no longer cared about family tradition, old money, or reputations, at least as far as she was concerned. The streets of the village were empty in the deluge. the glowing lamplight casting lonely pools of gold on the slick pavement. Emma walked into the rain, the cold, stinging her cheeks, suitcase rattling behind her. There was no destination in her mind, just the fierce, caged instinct for escape. Her pain, unable to find a voice within the Taylor family, found expression in the act of leaving. Outside the safety of privilege and expectation, Emma felt a strange relief mingle with the grief, a sense of reclaiming her own narrative, however shattered it might be. She knew the wound of accusation would never heal completely. The betrayal had carved a hollow into her heart, but as she moved further from the estate and into the unknown, hope returned, faint but persistent. For in the bitterest moment, an innocence condemned, a soul exiled, Emma discovered the flicker of something the Taylors could never touch, the courage to begin again. She was no longer the perfect daughter-in-law, nor a victim paralyzed by whispers and suspicion. She was, for the first time in years, wholly herself, chiseling her own story from the ruins of her former life. The wound could not be defended, but it could be survived. And as Emma watched the first rays of morning filter through the storm clouds, she realized that one day, even this unbearable pain might become the foundation for something new. America, the land of opportunity, stepping into the roaring rain and away from the only life she'd ever known. Emma Taylor felt for the first time in years that her fate was entirely her own. The world outside the Taylor estate was uncertain and raw, nothing like the cushioned domesticity of her former existence. But as she rode the late-night train north to the city, Emma felt a strange exhilaration thread through her sorrow. There was nothing left to lose, and in that emptiness, a quiet kind of hope began to grow. Seattle was never part of her plan. The Pacific Northwest, damp and green, shrouded in mist, was a world apart from the manicured lawns and colonial porches of upstate New York. But when Emma stepped off the bus one gray morning, clutching her battered suitcase and heavy with exhaustion, she looked at the skyline through streaks of drizzle and made a decision. She would start over here, as unremarkable and anonymous as any new arrival in America's transient cities. And she would do so on her own terms. The first time in years, her last name and its burdens meant absolutely nothing. The first weeks blurred together in a haze of cheap motel rooms, job applications, and cups of instant coffee, sipped while watching the harbor's cranes move like patient guardians through morning fog. Emma took what work she could find. She poured lattes in a cramped downtown coffee shop for minimum wage, standing long hours and learning to smile at customers whose pleasant chatter sometimes felt like a balm. At night, in her shared apartment, a cold, box-like room above a noisy pizza parlor, she stared at the city lights, reminding herself that she owed nothing to anyone anymore. Each paycheck, no matter how small, felt like proof of her resilience. Seattle's rain, relentless but gentle, carved a kind of stillness in her that New York's brittle cold never had. On rare days when the sun broke through, Emma walked the city's hilly streets, letting the wind scour her thoughts clean. She made it a ritual to visit Pike Place Market, breathing in the mingled scents of salt water and fresh flowers, gathering little reminders that beauty still existed, just in smaller, quieter ways than before. But starting over was more than survival. It was transformation. Emma remembered the advice of her father, a mechanic from a blue-collar Pennsylvania town, who'd always believed that hard work was its own reward. With her savings growing, she enrolled part-time in night classes at a local community college, sitting at the back of accounting lectures and taking copious notes. She studied late into the night, red-eyed but determined, forcing herself to master each lesson. For every test passed, for every new skill learned, she built a little more armor against the pain of her past. The months turned to years. Emma earned a business management certificate, then a bachelor's degree from a small university, putting herself through school by picking up extra shifts and tutoring other students in her spare time. She moved into her own studio, a wobbly walk-up, but hers alone, and joined a local women's entrepreneur network. What she lacked in connections, she made up for with determination and careful observation. Friendship, at first, came slow. Emma knew how to be polite and gracious from her years as a hostess in the Taylor household, but building real bonds required more than social niceties. Yet eventually, people noticed her steadiness, her quiet willingness to help when no one else volunteered. She found allies. Maria, a single mother in her marketing class with a wicked sense of humor. Clara, a former chef who dreamed of starting her own food truck and who insisted Emma was way smarter than she'd ever admit. These women became her family, urging her forward when old doubts resurfaced. Her ideas for her own business were born gradually, out of need and observation. Emma saw how many small shops struggled with basic operations, inventory management, digital payments, online marketing. She'd watched her in-laws get lost in outdated spreadsheets and inefficient routines. Now she imagined a service that could do better for all the people left behind as business moved online. The project took shape in after-hours brainstorming sessions, fueled by takeout and encouragement from her friends. With little capital but iron will, Emma launched her startup in her late 20s. She called it Next Level, an unapologetically American name, she thought, and a promise to herself. The first customers were skeptical, but Emma's patience and absolute dedication won them over. She offered 24/7 support, visiting local bakeries and bookstores, herself setting up their systems on creaky laptops. Word of mouth spread, and so did Emma's reputation for competence and kindness. There were nights when she worked until dawn, debugging code or reassuring an anxious client. Her life was often messy and improvisational. Ramen noodles at the kitchen table, board meetings held in cramped coffee houses, invoices hand-delivered on rainy evenings. But Emma felt alive, shaped by every small victory and every setback. In this world, there was no about family politics or old money. There was only the work, the result, the freedom to fail and try again. As her business grew, Emma reinvested every dollar. Next Level hired its first employees, mostly women like herself, hungry for a chance to build something of their own. She offered flexible schedules and fair pay. She remembered too well what it felt like to be overlooked, so she built a culture of respect and possibility. Her company developed cloud software that soon garnered attention from investors in Silicon Valley. A modest angel investment led to an expansion, then to a headline in a local tech journal. Woman-led startup redefines Main Street. Emma was invited to speak at small business conferences, the audience hanging on her advice as she recounted, in careful, understated terms, the resilience it took to rise from nothing. No one there knew her former life. No one cared about her past, except as another story of American renewal. Yet even as she thrived, there were moments when the old wounds throbbed. Sometimes she'd wake from dreams of stately manners and chilly silences, of a family dinner table where her place was always a matter of scrutiny and not quite belonging. She let the ache be a reminder. Never again would her worth depend on how others saw her. In America, she realized, you could choose your own definition of success, and your own family, too. By the time her business was profitable, Emma was in her early 30s. She moved into a glass-walled condo overlooking Puget Sound, decorated with simple elegance and filled with laughter on weekends. She volunteered at a local shelter, mentored young women starting new lives after hardship, and sponsored scholarship funds at her alma mater. Each step, each kindness, was a small act of reclamation. America was not a place of easy miracles. It often felt indifferent or unfair. But in its vastness and uncertainty, Emma discovered an extraordinary freedom. The daughter-in-law, once nothing more than a footnote in someone else's story, was now the author of her own. She had not simply survived. She had turned survival into creation, and loneliness into leadership. Looking out across the rainy, pulsing city she called home, Emma finally understood. Her second act was the truest one yet. Reflections and transformation.
Good morning.
Seattle's perpetual gray sky had become something like a mirror for Emma, reflecting both her solitude and the strength she had scraped together, bit by bit, since the night she'd left the Taylor estate behind. Some mornings, as she sipped her coffee by the window of her condo, she found herself drifting between past and present. The city's distant horns and the hum of life from the streets down below would blend with memories, unbidden, from those years in upstate New York. The flashbacks were rarely kind. They would appear while she was working late on a new pitch or reviewing a contract. Her mind suddenly swept away by a snatch of music from a time-worn piano, or the scent of cinnamon wafting from a bakery, so achingly similar to the cozy kitchen she had once tended with care and hope. These memories always carried the weight of contradiction. They were at once reminders of belonging, in proof of how unsteady belonging could be. Emma did not shy away from these recollections any longer. If anything, she welcomed them as part of the bargain she'd made by starting over. There were nights when, weary to her core, after a day spent overseeing her team or troubleshooting a client's disaster, that she'd sit in bed and let the memories play out. The pain was acute at first, a sense of loss so total it choked her. She'd recall the sound of Mark's voice, gentle yet now completely unreachable, or Helen's regal composure and the cold gleam in her eyes during that final, silent accusation. But gradually, the suffering transformed. It became something different, less of a wound and more of a scar, a mark of survival, not victimhood. Emma began to notice how those old patterns of expectation and self-doubt, gifts from her past life, would rise in her whenever she faced new challenges. The urge to seek approval, to be the good one, never ruffle feathers, had haunted her even in Seattle. At work, she caught herself apologizing for making tough decisions, or for being too assertive in business meetings. She doubted herself each time a client hesitated, or a colleague questioned her plan. For a long while, these habits frustrated her. It felt as though, no matter how far she had come, the imprint of the Taylor family, its hierarchy, its love of appearances, its quiet cruelties, could not be erased. Then, just after her company landed its first truly significant client, Emma's therapist suggested keeping a nightly journal. Write as if no one else will ever read it, she urged. Emma took the advice seriously. At first, the writing was tentative and sparse. She chronicled her days, recording doubts, victories, and those sudden, sharp memories of her former life. Over time, the exercise took on a life of its own. In her journals, she confronted the versions of herself she'd been: faithful wife, placater, silent observer, as well as the sharper, more guarded woman she was becoming. What unfolded surprised her. The journal pages didn't only reflect loss. They celebrated small acts of rebellion, pushing back against a short-sighted investor, taking credit for a bold idea, gently but firmly, letting a friend know her boundaries. Each entry marked a shift, however minor, away from deference and toward agency. Emma realized she was not simply discarding the old Emma. She was forging someone new, refractory and resilient, out of all her broken pieces. These changes, though subtle at first, became apparent in the way she moved through her life. Her team noticed. Where Emma once accepted extra work in silence, she now delegated and stood by her standards, respectfully and without apology. She grew bolder in negotiations, holding firm when clients pushed for discounts or doubted her proposals. Even in the most competitive, male-dominated rooms of Seattle's startup scene, Emma's quiet confidence began to set her apart. It was not a perfect evolution. There were setbacks, disappointments that stung, moments of regression when shame or self-doubt crept back in. After one particularly grueling week, when a large contract evaporated due to circumstances beyond her control, Emma nearly let herself spiral. Instead of retreating, she picked up her journal and wrote through the night, dissecting every emotion, allowing herself to grieve losses, both old and new. As the months, then years, unspooled, Emma's circle of friends grew stronger and more loyal. The women who had first buoyed her in Seattle became soulmates. They celebrated her promotions, comforted her after heartbreaks, and challenged her when she faltered. Maria, ever irreverent, often reminded Emma that her steeliness was something you earned, not something you got for free. Clara nominated Emma for an award for women in business, insisting she deserved her place among Seattle's most influential leaders. Despite her growing stature, Emma remained humble. She dedicated time to mentoring other women starting over, immigrants, single mothers, young people who felt invisible or overlooked. She regarded each act of support as a small way to tip the scales of fate, to make up for the times she herself was voiceless. Yet for all her new confidence, Emma knew she still carried parts of her former self. She acknowledged, finally, that the scars from the Taylor years would never disappear entirely. But instead of letting them define her, she wove them into her identity, neither cleaving to the bitterness nor denying the pain. She saw her story as a tapestry, the golden threads of ambition, the darker ones of betrayal and heartbreak, together forming something unmistakably hers. The transformation was evident not just internally, but in the way others perceived her. The local press, always seeking dramatic stories, once asked about her meteoric rise from humble beginnings. Emma smiled politely, knowing that they only glimpsed the surface. The real work, the quiet decision each day to be self-reliant, to never allow herself to blend into someone else's shadow again, was invisible to most. And there were moments of peaceful clarity, often during her solitary walks by the waterfront, when Emma would look back on everything and marvel at her own endurance. She was grateful for the ability to change, for the American promise that allowed a person to be more than the sum of their worst moments. The journey from obedient daughter-in-law to iron-willed entrepreneur had not been a straight line. It was more like a mountain pass, winding and arduous, with beauty and danger side by side. Emma no longer feared her memories. Instead, she carried them like a secret talisman, proof that she could survive and thrive, regardless of circumstance. When she glanced at the skyline and saw the city alive with possibility, she was reminded that her transformation was hard-won, and holy tours. The reunion. 10 years had passed since Emma stepped out into the Seattle rain, clutching her suitcase and grasping at the unnamed hope for a future she couldn't yet picture. With every year that followed, the chasm between her old life and new widened, filled not just with miles, but with all she had become. The ache of betrayal had grown into scar tissue. Emma had learned to glory in her independence, surrounded by friends she'd chosen and a life she had crafted, detail by detail, with intention and grit. Yet the past is never truly left behind. As the 10th autumn since her self-exile arrived, an unexpected letter reached her sleek, glass-walled condo in Seattle, adorned with thick embossed stationery and the familiar looping script of an elite New York law firm. The letter was as much a ghost as a message. Emma stared at it for several long moments before breaking the seal, a tremor of old pain fluttering beneath her well-earned confidence. The message was formal, but the news within was personal. A merger in the New York real estate market had floundered, leaving the Taylor family's once vast fortune and business on the brink of collapse. What was left of their legacy depended on an urgent infusion of capital. Out of everyone they knew, Helen and Mark had approached their attorneys and advisors, not for sympathy, but for introductions. Who, if anyone, among the high-flying West Coast investors might save them? Emma's name had surfaced more than once. At first, Emma's impulse was simple: close the letter, return it unanswered, and let the past decay as it had earned. But nights in Seattle can be long and introspective, and Emma found herself staring into the foggy darkness, replaying fragments of her old life. Did she owe them? Mark? Helen? The house she'd once so carefully tended? A voice? A reckoning? A last act? Or worse, did she still carry some shred of unfinished belonging in her heart? In the end, Emma decided she had nothing left to fear. She arranged her schedule, cleared her calendar, and booked a flight to New York. Stepping through the familiar chill of JFK Airport, she felt both utterly changed and uneasily nostalgic. A decade had altered her in profound ways, but the scent of autumn leaves and distant city smoke still tugged at her, a ghostly hand at her elbow. She arrived at the Taylor estate on a gray afternoon. The once magisterial grounds looked shabbier than she remembered. Weeds at the edges, the lawn less crisply shorn, a hint of neglect in the faded shutters. Gone was the house's aloof confidence. In its place was a quiet desperation. Inside, the air smelled mustier, echoing with the sounds of too many empty rooms. Helen, aged and fragile but still upright, waited in the parlor. Her stance was prideful as ever, but her eyes flickered with doubt, a far cry from the unassailable authority she once wore so easily. Mark appeared moments later, gaunt and gray at the temples, his familiar warmth now shadowed by evident regret. They greeted Emma not with family's embrace, but with the wary deference reserved for a creditor or a surgeon. The conversation was businesslike at first. The lawyers outlined the numbers. Helen gripped her teacup tightly as the details spilled out: bad partnerships, market crashes, and ill-advised expansion into commercial properties outside their expertise. Mark, who once radiated the bold certainty of a businessman on the ascent, now looked grounded by years of error, humbled in the wake of it all. They spoke of restructuring and investment, but beneath their polite pleas, Emma heard something else: remorse, fear, and memory. When the lawyers retreated, silence fell. Only then did the reunion become personal. Helen studied her across the table, her voice trembling as she said, "We never expected we would have to ask you for help." Mark averted his gaze, his hands twisting in his lap. thinner and more vulnerable than she remembered. "Emma, I'm sorry. For then. For everything," he said, each word pulled from him like a confession. Emma allowed the silence to linger, absorbing the weight of what had passed between them all those years ago. The accusation, the isolation, the unspoken question that had, until now, never really been answered. Did they believe her innocence? Did she still have a place in this story? Or was she now merely the deus ex machina, the outsider whose ascent might redeem their fall? She answered with honesty and calm. "You didn't have to believe me then, because you didn't want to see the truth. But the world changes. We all do. I'm not here to punish you, but if I help, it will be as a business partner, not as family. We'll write down everything, every term. You'll answer to me, not the other way around. Not to the Emma you remember, but the one I am now." Helen nodded, her composure momentarily shaken. Mark seemed to release a breath he'd held for years. In that moment, all their histories seemed to hang in the air, tense, unfinished, but possibly able to be remade. The negotiations that followed were clinical, though Emma brought her characteristic fairness and clarity. She pored over financial statements, scrutinized the estate's debts, asked hard questions, and demanded straight answers. When Helen faltered, when Mark grew defensive or ashamed, Emma maintained her professional edge, not out of coldness, but out of hard-earned self-respect. In the evenings, she took solitary walks around the grounds. The autumn leaves still shimmered gold and red, much as they had in her earliest days as a tailor. She revisited the kitchen, the cinnamon scent replaced now by the faint odor of dust, and the back veranda where laughter once rang out over Sunday brunches. These places had once contained her. Now, she realized, she contained them. Her memories, her versions, her power. As the paperwork was finalized, Helen and Mark found moments of vulnerability. Helen apologized late one night in a trembling voice, admitting the family's fear and short-sightedness. "We were proud," she said, "and afraid to be wrong."
Yes, this is Detective
Mark,
Miller.
alone with Emma in the paneled study, confessed his doubts, his inability to fight customs stronger than his love or his own instincts.
Any new leads on
"You
the car?
deserved better," he murmured. And for once, Emma believed he meant it. When the deal was done, Emma declined all invitations to celebrate. "This isn't a victory lap," she reminded them. "Just the beginning of a new sort of honesty." She left early on a clear October morning, her heart lighter, not because she had conquered the past, but because she had faced it and found herself unbroken. Driving away from the Taylor house, Emma felt no gloating satisfaction, only a deep, liberating serenity. The Emma who had once needed approval and belonging was gone. In her place stood a woman who understood her own worth, defined by neither exile nor acceptance, but by her unbreakable will to transform. As she returned to Seattle, she carried with her not triumph, but closure, a final act in a play that had, for far too long, been weighed down by silence and old wounds. In the land of opportunity, Emma had seized not only her chance, but the power to forgive and to move forward on her own terms. Collapse and justice. In the wake of Emma's return to New York, the Taylor estate sat poised on the knife's edge. Newspapers whispered about the family's fall from grace. Once the proud stewards of sprawling properties and gracious hostesses of charity galas, the Taylors were now forced to reckon with the erosion of both their fortune and their reputation. Yet, the real reckoning, the forceful, private drama of justice and collapse, played out within a world of legal forms, heartfelt conversations, and the slow, painful process of facing the truth. After Emma's frank negotiations and the businesslike restructuring deal, the Taylor family's vulnerabilities became impossible to ignore. Mark and Helen tried to resume a semblance of their former social standing, but the sharp-eyed socialites of upstate New York knew that something fundamental had shifted. Invitations slowed to a trickle. The family's ancient alliances with bankers and political figures no longer opened doors so easily. Rumors flourished, spun by those who had for years both envied and admired the Taylor's aura of perfection. Inside the estate, Helen moved like a shadow, her graceful composure now punctuated by bouts of remorse. She spent long afternoons reading in the parlor, phone calls to old friends growing rare. Mark, having lost much of his easy confidence, buried himself in the logistical grind of saving what little remained, including the menial tasks his father would never have deigned to touch. The pair clung to familiar rituals, but they seemed haunted by the audience of their own memories. A family drama staged for no one but themselves. Meanwhile, Emma's reappearance in their lives sent ripples through the quiet community. There was, among some, grudging respect. For others, those still invested in the old ways, her success on the West Coast was dismissed as luck, her return interpreted as either magnanimity or cold calculation. The truth, as ever, was more complicated. Emma had returned for closure and justice, not revenge, in accepting the role of business partner rather than supplicant or martyr. She made clear to all observers that her worth transcended gossip. But even she could not ignore the satisfaction of seeing Helen and Mark face the consequences of choices made in fear and pride. The legal reckoning was thorough. Emma and her own legal advisors combed through the Taylor business records, a process much more diligent than anyone in the family would have tolerated in their era of prosperity. Old discrepancies, once overlooked, demanded explanation. Vendors Emma had never met were interviewed, and audits stretched back years. Inefficiencies, mistakes, and hints of mismanagement presented themselves ruthlessly, each line item a testament to years of complacency. Emma refused to allow the process to devolve into scapegoating or drama. If she was to invest, if anyone was, the rot would have to be cut out completely, regardless of how many Taylor traditions were trampled. Helen's pride was battered, but not destroyed. She endured the public unraveling with stoic grace, even as she admitted, sometimes with tears late at night, that she had not only failed as a matriarch, but as a guardian of her family's integrity. Mark's confession hurt more. He admitted his quiet acquiescence during Emma's accusation was not only cowardice, but a desperate attempt to preserve an image of himself as the obedient son and capable heir. The personal cost of that image was now evident. The collapse of the Taylor reputation, at least in the eyes of their old peers, was swift, but not absolute. In the 21st century world, privilege did not vanish overnight, and the Taylors were not consigned to poverty. But their life of unquestioned respect and influence was gone. Properties were sold, rooms in the estate were shut, and the once grand gatherings became modest, muted affairs. But justice, in Emma's mind, meant something more than humiliation. It was about truth. She arranged for an independent review of the original evidence that had damned her a decade earlier. Financed by her own firm and conducted without interference from any Taylor or their friends. It was exhaustive and meticulous. It took months, but at last, the imbalances and mistaken logins that had pointed to Emma were revealed for what they truly were: errors of software, accidental overlaps from another employee, shady dealings completely unrelated to her. Her name was cleared, not by dramatic confession, but by the quiet certitude of expert testimony and facts. Emma's vindication did not come with grand gestures. The local news didn't run headlines, and neighbors didn't organize parades. Instead, vindication came in private apologies, in the stunned relief and grief of Mark and Helen, and in the finality of silence. Her name, once whispered in suspicion, absent now from the village's rumor mill. The simple announcement from the auditors was all the acknowledgement she needed that her innocence had been returned. Helen's apology, when it came, was quiet and halting. The older woman sat across from Emma in the dim light of the library, hands trembling above the remnants of her once polished exterior. "I was so afraid to lose control," she admitted. "I couldn't see you clearly. I'm sorry. I truly am." Mark, for his part, offered his apologies not with words, but with action. A willingness to follow Emma's guidance in the restructured business, to defer where once he had dictated. Emma, for her part, offered forgiveness, not in a passionate display, but as an act of will. "We all pay for our mistakes, one way or another," she said simply. "What matters now is how we move forward." Honestly, this time, it was not an absolution, but a release, untying herself from the last threads of old pain. The collapse of the Taylor dynasty became, in hindsight, the start of something more honest. The estate shrank, but the family found an unexpected resilience. Mark sought therapy, laid plans for a business with transparent rules and humble goals, finally embracing hard truths. Helen, freed from the pressure of grandeur, rediscovered simple joys. Gardening, teaching etiquette classes at the local community center, reconnecting with the women she'd once disdained. For Emma, justice came not just from clearing her name, but from using her hard-won wisdom to reshape lives, her own and theirs. She returned to Seattle with a sense of indelible closure, her story known by those who mattered most. The world had not righted itself magically, but she had found justice enough to walk forward. As autumn cloaked the old New York hills in gold, the Taylor estate faded into memory, a symbol not of what Emma lost, but what she reclaimed, her dignity, her freedom, and a legacy, defined on her own terms. Justice, after all, was not revenge. It was the quiet, unassailable knowledge that one's truth had finally been seen.